This is Sony's entry-level 85mm prime lens for their full-frame cameras. In this video, I'm going to tell you why you should buy this over their 85mm f1.4 G Master lens. Getting right into it, Sony's 85mm G Master lens is undoubtedly the more technically superior and more feature-packed lens when comparing it to this 85mm, but those extra features come at an extraordinarily high cost, and the chances are that you won't actually make the most of those extra features that the G Master offers unless you're something like a high-end professional portrait photographer, for example. For everything else, this lens right here is more than enough and it's excellent value. So let's start with the physical features of this lens. And my biggest surprise when I first got it was how well built it was considering the price, which we'll get onto in a little bit. It's reassuringly dense and sturdy in the hand, and it feels like overall like a really high quality lens. In the box you get the lens itself, front and back lens caps, and also a lens hood. The lens has a large and smooth focus ring, which you'll likely sparingly use because the autofocus on this lens is so good. On the side of the lens there is a physical autofocus switch, which allows you to switch between autofocus and manual focus. As someone who uses the A7C, this is really nice because the A7C lacks a lot of mappable custom buttons to assign this to. Also, there's a customizable focus hold button right next to the autofocus switch. I must admit I don't really use this much at all, but if you have a need for it, then it's there. Sony also claims that this lens is dust and moisture resistant, whatever that means, but fundamentally, this lens isn't weather sealed because it doesn't have a rubber gasket around the lens mount. I don't tend to take my camera out in bad weather, especially not heavy rain, but basically if you want to be sure that your camera won't get waterlogged, I wouldn't recommend taking your camera out with this lens on it in heavy rain or bad weather conditions. Moving on to the actual performance of this lens, I think it's fantastic. It's super sharp, especially in the center of the image, and the bokeh mostly looks great, but sometimes it is a little bit distorted and can come out in some funky shapes, especially towards the edge of the image. But what really matters to me about this lens is how the out of focus areas look, and the best way to describe them is kind of creamy. It looks really good to my eyes. Fundamentally, the roll off of the focus is really nice and smooth, meaning that it's not distracting at all. In terms of general photography, the 85mm f1.8 is extremely versatile, and surprisingly so in my case. Before I got the 85mm lens, I kind of assumed it would be kind of limited in terms of the use cases you could use it for. In terms of obviously portrait photography, that's kind of an obvious one, but I found that it's really good for landscape photography and also street photography as well. Obviously for portraits, wide open at f1.8 and with the compression of the 85mm lens, they just look really good with that subject separation and, like I said, the smooth roll off of the out of focus areas. And the sharpness really brings out the subject, whether that is a person, an animal, or an object. For landscapes, it provides a different perspective and allows you to focus in on particular features, which I really like. And similarly for street photography, it allows you to focus in on particular details on buildings or on the street level or on people that are walking down the street, and that provides kind of a really nice perspective for me. That's something you can't really get out of a 50mm or 35mm or wide angle lens like you can with this 85mm. Moving on to video, and there are two main standout things for me about this lens. Firstly, the compression of the focal length plus the wide aperture allow you to make really truly cinematic looking video. Now this is obviously subjective as it really depends on what you define cinematic is, but for me personally, I think it outputs a really professional looking and crisp looking image, which really looks pleasing to the eye. The second standout thing for me is the quiet, reliable, and super fast autofocus, which works really well to keep whatever you're shooting in sharp focus. So let's come back to Sony's 85mm f1.4 G Master lens. And the question is, what does that lens have over this 85mm f1.8 budget option? There are a few key differences. Firstly, the wider aperture of f1.4 will allow you to get a lot better performance in low light and also allow you to get much better subject separation between your subject and the background. But in my experience at f1.8, this does a really good job of doing that. Secondly, I mentioned before that sometimes the bokeh on the f1.8 lens isn't always super round. However, on the G Master you actually have 11 aperture blades as opposed to the f1.8's 9 aperture blades. This means that you should actually end up with more consistently round and, pleasing looking bokeh out of the G Master lens. So if that's something you frequently find yourself needing when shooting portraits, objects, or whatever with your 85mm, then I would go for the G Master. Thirdly, the G Master has a nano texture coating on the front of the glass, which actually is meant to limit ghosting and glare. So if you're shooting around kind of harsh light sources quite a lot, then this actually might be really useful for you as well. However, not all differences between the two lenses are advantages for the G Master. In fact, there's two actual things that are probably going to determine which lens you buy here. Firstly, there is a huge weight difference between these two lenses, with the more budget option coming in at 371 grams, whereas the G Master is a whopping 820 grams, which is about 2.2 times the weight of the cheaper budget option. So if you're planning on getting an 85mm for traveling specifically, I think the f1.8 would probably be the clear option here. And finally, and probably most importantly, I've mentioned that the f1.8 is cheaper than the G Master, but it really comes down to how much cheaper here. The 1.8 comes in at an RRP of $600 or £530, whereas the G Master comes in at $1,800 or £1,750, which is a huge difference. So basically, if you got the f1.8, you'd be saving yourself $1,200, which is a massive amount of money. I managed to pick up this lens for only £350, which is about 430 US dollars at the time of filming. And that's a really low price for this lens. So I'd keep an eye out on sales to pick this up when it's at a nice cheap price. Now you may have already commented down below, Arran, why are you comparing Sony's entry-level 85mm to Sony's highest end 85mm G Master lens? And that's because I think that you get about 90% of the features and the capability of the G Master lens in this entry-level lens for so much less money. And that's super important. Fundamentally, the decision of which one you buy, I'm assuming you want to buy one of these lenses because you're watching this video, is down to you and your personal circumstances. If you are a high-end portrait photographer, firstly, why are you watching my videos? But secondly, you probably want to buy the G Master because you'll probably actually use those extra features to the fullest effect. Whereas someone who is an entry-level photographer, videographer, probably won't notice the difference in their work. So I think for the vast majority of people, Sony's 85mm f1.8 entry-level lens is a must-have in your camera bag. If you do want to pick up this lens, then I've put a link down in the description below. And I'm also really curious to hear what you guys think of the 85mm lenses from Sony. So drop me a comment down below. And on your way down there, you might want to hit that subscribe button to keep up with all my latest videos as they come out. Otherwise, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.